Picture a typical British neighborhood. Trim hedges, parked prams, the distant laughter of children. This is Sheffield's Shire Green Estate, where in 2019, a house just like any other became the scene of an unthinkable crime. Inside, Sarah Barris, a 35-year-old single mother, and her half-brother Brandon McKinn plotted the murders of their own children. Not in a fit of rage, not by accident, but through calculated, cold-blooded planning that would leave detectives speechless. 6 children lived in that house. 6 children who called her Mum. 2 would nearly die. The others would carry scars no child should bear. But the most shocking detail wasn't the violence, it was the motive. Because this wasn't about money, wasn't about revenge. This was about keeping a secret so vile, so socially unacceptable, that Sarah and Brandon believed murder was their only way out. For years, red flags were missed. Teachers noticed bruises. Social workers filed reports. Neighbors heard screams. Yet time and again, the system looked the other way, dismissing Sarah as just another overwhelmed single mother. Meanwhile, behind those closed doors, something far more sinister was unfolding. A forbidden relationship between siblings that had festered for decades, now spiraling into something monstrous. On May 23, 2019, the unthinkable happened. First, an overdose. Then, when that failed, hands around tiny throats. What happened next would expose not just the family's dark secrets, but the catastrophic failures that allowed this tragedy to unfold. This is the story of how a mother became a murderer, and how the people who should have protected those children failed them at every turn. Stick with us as we unravel one of Britain's most disturbing family annihilator cases, where the monsters weren't strangers. They were the very people those children trusted most. To understand how a mother could plot to kill her own children, we must first unravel the twisted family web that made such horror possible. Sarah Barris and Brandon McKinn didn't just share a home, they shared blood. Born just a year apart, these half-siblings grew up in the same troubled Sheffield household, their childhood marked by instability and neglect. But somewhere along the way, their bond warped into something far more sinister. By their early teens, what should have been a normal sibling relationship had curdled into something forbidden. Family members would later recall uneasy feelings about their closeness, the lingering touches, the secretive behavior. While other teenagers were sneaking out to meet friends, Sarah and Brandon were sneaking into each other's rooms. This wasn't puppy love. This was the beginning of a dangerous obsession that would span decades. As adults, their relationship took on a disturbing domesticity. Though Sarah would have children with other men, Brandon was always present, the shadowy uncle figure who never quite fit the role. Neighbors noticed his constant presence, how he seemed more like a live-in partner than a family member. But no one could have imagined the truth, that these two were not just siblings but lovers, and that some of Sarah's children were also Brandon's. The family facade began showing cracks. Sarah's parenting swung wildly between smothering affection and terrifying cruelty. Children were homeschooled abruptly, cut off from friends. Social services received multiple warnings about bruises, about the kids appearing malnourished, about the strange dynamic in that household. But each time, Sarah's charm and Brandon's quiet intimidation turned investigators away. Behind closed doors, their shared secret festered into paranoia. As the children grew older and more likely to talk, Sarah and Brandon's fear of exposure grew. What began as whispered worries escalated into dark discussions. How far would they go to protect their secret? The answer, when it came, would shock even seasoned detectives. This wasn't just a crime of passion or momentary madness. The roots of the tragedy were planted years earlier, in that distorted sibling bond that blurred all boundaries of right and wrong. When love becomes obsession, when family loyalty trumps morality, the unthinkable starts to seem possible. And for Sarah and Brandon, the unthinkable was about to become reality. The tragedy of the Barris children wasn't that no one saw the danger signs, it's that everyone saw them and no one acted. Years before the murders, the system had multiple opportunities to intervene. Teachers noticed the bruises that always seemed to appear after accidents at home. Neighbors heard the screaming matches that went deep into the night. Even doctors raised eyebrows at the frequency of mysterious injuries. Yet time and again these warnings were dismissed, ignored, or the children's behavior until it was a disturbing story. Some withdrew completely, flinching at sudden movements. Others acted out violently, mirroring what they experienced at home. One teacher recalled a chilling moment when a 7-year-old drew a family portrait, with his own figure scribbled out. When asked why, he simply said, "That's what Mum wants." The school filed a report. Nothing changed. Social services were called multiple times between 2014 and 2018. Each visit followed the same pattern. Sarah would charm the workers, presenting a spotless home and well-fed children. Brandon would linger in the background, his silent presence unnerving. The kids, coached in advance, would recite the same stories about falling down the stairs or walking into doors. Caseworkers noted inconsistencies but closed the files, overwhelmed by caseloads and convinced by Sarah's performance as the struggling but devoted single mother. The most damning missed opportunity came in 2017 when an aunt contacted authorities with explicit concerns. She reported seeing Sarah force-feed one child until he vomited, then make him eat the vomit as punishment. She told them about Brandon's unexplained overnight stays, the children's terror when he raised his voice. The investigation lasted 3 weeks before being dropped. Sarah claimed the aunt was bitter over a family dispute. No one interviewed the children alone. No one checked the medical records showing multiple untreated fractures. Even when police were called to the house after a particularly violent incident in early 2019, just months before the murders, they left without making arrests. Body cam footage shows a nervous 12-year-old trying to speak up before Sarah cuts him off. The officer's report concluded, domestic disturbance, no further action required. It was the final failure in a series of many, the last chance to save these children wasted. What makes these institutional failures so unforgivable isn't just their frequency, but their predictability. Every red flag had been documented before in other abuse cases that ended in tragedy. The overlooked bruises, the coached explanations, the charming parent who knows exactly what to say. The system saw all the signs but refused to connect the dots, until 2 children nearly died, and a mother's monstrous secret finally came to light. Behind closed doors, Sarah Barris and Brandon McKinn weren't just siblings. They were accomplices in a life built on secrets. What started as a twisted bond in their youth had festered, evolving into something far more dangerous. By adulthood, their relationship wasn't just hidden. It was weaponized. Sarah married other men, had children by them. But Brandon was always there, lurking in the background, playing the role of uncle. A convenient cover. Yet with every child born, the risk grew. These kids weren't just theirs, they were proof. Living, breathing evidence of a sin society would never forgive. And then the unthinkable became inevitable. When social services began circling, Sarah and Brandon didn't panic. They strategized. The children, once a twisted symbol of their bond, were now liabilities. If authorities took them away, the truth might come out. And that was unacceptable. Their conversations turned darker. Whispers behind closed doors. Plans scribbled on scraps of paper. The fear of exposure curdled into something far more sinister. A belief that death was preferable to discovery. Better off dead than in care, Sarah would later say. It wasn't grief talking. It was control. The children, of course, had no idea. They saw the tension, the hushed arguments, the way Brandon's presence made their mother's smile tighten. But kids adapt. They rationalize. When your world is all you've ever known, you don't question its cracks. Not until it's too late. By 2019, the delusion was complete. Sarah and Brandon weren't just hiding their past, they were rewriting their future. And in their warped logic, that future required erasing the very lives they'd created. The stage was set. The plan was in motion. All that remained was the act itself. What happens next isn't just murder. It's betrayal in its purest, most unforgivable form. Because the people who were supposed to protect these children, they were the ones who decided they had to die. By May 2019, Sarah Barris and Brandon McKinn had reached their psychological breaking point. The pressure of their secret life, the lies, the constant fear of exposure, the children growing old enough to understand, had twisted their reality into something monstrous. What began as whispered worries had hardened into a terrifying conviction. Their children had to die. The trigger came when social services finally threatened serious intervention. After years of near misses, authorities were preparing to remove the children, and with them, the risk that their incestuous relationship would be exposed. For Sarah, this wasn't just about losing her kids. It was about losing control. The same woman who once posted loving tributes to motherhood on Facebook now saw her children as threats to be eliminated. Their planning was chillingly methodical. First, they researched poisons, common household medications that could be disguised as flu treatment. When that proved unreliable, they devised a backup plan: manual suffocation. Sarah even rehearsed the act, testing pressure points on herself while Brandon timed how long it would take. These weren't spontaneous acts of violence, but calculated steps in what they saw as their only way out. The children, sensing the growing tension but unaware of its true nature, became walking on eggshells. One later told police about finding their mother crying in the kitchen, whispering, "I have to do this over and over." Another recalled Brandon practicing strange games, where he'd demonstrate how to hold someone down. These weren't warnings recognized in time, they became evidence in hindsight. On the night of May 23rd, Sarah gathered her children for what she called special medicine, a cocktail of pills crushed into juice. As they grew drowsy, she and Brandon moved them to beds, waiting for the overdose to take effect. When some began vomiting instead of dying, their backup plan swung into action. What followed was 8 hours of unimaginable horror: children waking to their mother's hands around their throats, siblings screaming for help, and Sarah's voice calmly insisting, "This is for the best." The breaking point had come, not just for Sarah and Brandon but for the children who finally fought back. One boy, though weakened from the drugs, managed to escape and alert a neighbor. His desperate 999 call, "They've tried to kill us all," would shatter the carefully constructed facade of a normal family. But for two children, the rescue came too late. This wasn't a crime of passion or momentary insanity. Every detail, from the poison research to the rehearsals, reveals the terrifying truth: these were parents who chose murder as a solution. When the walls closed in on their secret world, Sarah and Brandon didn't break down. They doubled down and turned their children into casualties of their own warped survival instinct. The night of May 23, 2019, began like any other in the Barris household. The children finished their dinners, unaware that their mother had laced their drinks with a lethal cocktail of prescription drugs. As the first symptoms took hold, dizziness, nausea, confusion, Sarah and Brandon herded them to bed, whispering that it was just a bad flu. But this was no illness. It was the first phase of a meticulously planned murder. When the overdose failed to kill them, Sarah and Brandon moved to Plan B. One by one, they entered the children's rooms, pressing pillows over their faces, hands clamping down on small throats. The siblings fought back, kicking, scratching, gasping for air, but their weakened bodies were no match for two determined adults. The house echoed with muffled screams, the thud of struggling limbs against beds, and the chilling sound of Sarah's voice, steady and cold, "Just go to sleep. It'll be over soon." Then a miracle. One child, though drugged and disoriented, managed to break free. He stumbled to a neighbor's house, his body trembling, his words barely coherent. "They're killing us. Please help." Within minutes, police were at the scene. What they found defied comprehension. Children limp and barely breathing, their lips tinged blue, their skin clammy. Sarah, still in her pajamas, stood in the hallway, her expression eerily blank. Brandon lurked in the shadows, his hands clenched into fists. The surviving children later recounted the horror in fractured, traumatized details. One described waking up to his mother's hands around his neck, her face twisted into something unrecognizable. Another recalled the sound of his little brother gasping, then going silent. The oldest, just 13, remembered Brandon pinning him down, his breath hot and reeking of alcohol, snarling, "Stop fighting, you little shit." But the most haunting revelation came from the autopsy reports. The drugs alone would have been fatal if not for the children's resistance. Sarah and Brandon hadn't just attempted murder. They had ensured it was slow, agonizing, and intimate. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was an execution. As paramedics fought to save the children, Sarah was overheard murmuring to Brandon, "We almost got away with it." That single sentence laid bare the truth. This wasn't about protecting the kids from some imagined fate. It was about protecting themselves, their secret, their freedom, their warped version of love. By sunrise, 2 children were dead. The others bore the scars, physical and psychological, of a night that should have never happened. And as the police led Sarah and Brandon away in handcuffs, one question hung in the air: how could a mother do this? The answer, buried in years of lies, manipulation, and a bond so toxic it destroyed everything in its path, was worse than anyone could have imagined. The aftermath of the Barris-McKin case sent shockwaves through Sheffield and beyond. As the surviving children were rushed to hospital, fighting for their lives, police began unraveling the full horror of what had transpired. Inside the house, investigators found chilling evidence: crushed pill residue on kitchen counters, handwritten notes calculating drug dosages, and a bathroom where the final, violent acts had taken place. But most damning of all were the digital footprints. Search histories revealing months of research on fatal overdoses and suffocation methods. Sarah and Brandon were arrested within hours. Initially, they stuck to their fabricated story, a tragic accident, a desperate mother giving her children cold medicine that had somehow turned deadly. But under interrogation, their alibis crumbled. Brandon broke first, his detached demeanor giving way to panicked excuses. Then Sarah, confronted with the surviving children's testimonies, finally admitted the truth, not out of remorse but resignation. "We had no choice," she told detectives, her voice devoid of emotion. They would have told everyone. The trial that followed was one of Britain's most disturbing family court cases. Prosecutors painted a picture of calculated cruelty, presenting evidence that the murders had been planned for weeks. The surviving children, now in foster care, gave video testimony that left the courtroom in tears. One boy describing how he'd played dead to survive his mother's strangulation attempt. Child psychologists confirmed the years of abuse preceding the murders, while digital forensic experts outlined the cold, clinical research Sarah and Brandon had conducted into killing methods. The defense's argument, that this was a case of diminished responsibility, that years of hiding their incestuous relationship had warped their judgment, fell flat. Psychiatrists testified that while both defendants had personality disorders, they understood exactly what they were doing. The judge agreed, calling their actions a grotesque betrayal of parenthood, motivated by pure selfishness. In November 2019, the verdict came swiftly, guilty on all counts. Sarah Barris and Brandon McKinn were each given life sentences with minimum terms of 35 years, one of the longest sentences ever handed down for familial murder in UK history. As the sentences were read, Sarah showed no reaction, while Brandon briefly closed his eyes. Outside the courthouse, the prosecutor told reporters, this wasn't a crime of passion or madness. This was cold, premeditated murder by the people these children should have been able to trust most. The case left permanent scars. Social services launched an urgent review into why multiple warnings had been ignored. The surviving children, though physically recovered, would carry the trauma forever. One foster parent describing how the youngest still woke screaming, reliving the night his mother tried to kill him. And in Sheffield's Shiregreen estate, the house stood empty for months before being demolished, neighbors unable to bear its haunting presence. Perhaps the most chilling legacy emerged in prison letters Brandon later sent to a journalist. In neat handwriting, he mused that he and Sarah could have gotten away with it, if not for that one child's escape. No apology. No remorse. Just the clinical assessment of a failed plan, and the unshakable sense that for these two, the real crime wasn't the murders but getting caught. The psychology behind Sarah Barris and Brandon McKinn's crimes reveals a terrifying truth. This wasn't madness, but a calculated unraveling of morality. Forensic psychiatrists who evaluated them found no psychosis, no break from reality. Instead, they uncovered something far more disturbing. Two people who had systematically dehumanized their own children to justify murder. Sarah's psychological profile showed hallmark traits of narcissistic personality disorder, not the grandiose type, but the covert variety. She viewed her children as extensions of herself, their value determined solely by how they served her needs. When they threatened her secret life, she didn't see murder as evil, but as necessary housekeeping. Her prison journals contained no remorse, only self-pity, pages lamenting how unfair it was that she couldn't see her surviving children, never acknowledging she tried to kill them. Brandon presented as the more detached partner, his psych evaluations revealing schizoid tendencies with explosive anger beneath the surface. Where Sarah rationalized, Brandon compartmentalized, able to research murder methods 1 hour, then eat dinner with the children the next. Psychiatrists noted his frightening ability to switch off empathy, describing the children in trial testimony as problems needing solutions rather than human beings. Their shared delusion was perhaps the most chilling aspect. Years of mutual reinforcement had created a private morality where incest was love, murder was protection, and social workers were the real villains. Prison correspondents showed they still framed themselves as victims, writing that nobody understands our bond. This wasn't folie à deux in the clinical sense, but something arguably worse, two people who chose to corrupt each other completely. The children's psychological scars provided stark contrast. The surviving siblings exhibited textbook trauma responses, hypervigilance, attachment disorders, and in one heartbreaking case, self-blame. A child therapist testified that the youngest believed, "Mummy tried to kill me because I was bad." It underscored the ultimate tragedy. While Sarah and Brandon's warped psyches let them sleep soundly after murder, their victims would spend lifetimes wrestling with nightmares. Perhaps most telling was the experts' consensus: these weren't monsters born but made. Their toxic relationship had become an echo chamber, amplifying each other's worst impulses over decades. What began as teenage taboos spiraled into shared paranoia, then mutual destruction. The frightening lesson? Under the right, or rather terribly wrong, conditions, almost anyone's moral compass can be broken, given enough time, enough secrecy, and enough twisted love. In the end, the psychological postmortem leaves us with an uneasy question. How many other normal families hide similar fractures beneath the surface? The Barris-McKin case didn't just expose two disturbed individuals. It held up a mirror to society's failures in recognizing how ordinary-looking people can nurture extraordinary evil behind closed doors. The story of Sarah Barris and Brandon McKin forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The most dangerous monsters don't lurk in shadows, but in places we least expect. Family photo albums, school pickup lines, neighborhood WhatsApp groups. Their case wasn't just about individual evil, but about how systems designed to protect the vulnerable failed at every turn, until it was nearly too late. If you take one thing from this tragedy, let it be this: abuse thrives in silence. When you suspect something isn't right, a child's unexplained bruises, a friend's concerning comments about their home life, a neighbor's screaming matches that go too far, speak up. One call to authorities could be the thread that unravels a hidden nightmare. For the full, in-depth investigation into this case, including never-before-heard police interview excerpts and an exclusive look at the psychological evaluations, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Our team spends months piecing together these complex stories, and your support helps us keep digging into cases that matter. Below, you'll find links to child abuse prevention resources and organizations that help the survivors of this case rebuild their lives. If this story impacted you, consider donating or volunteering, because for every Sarah and Brandon out there, there are countless children still waiting for someone to notice their cries for help. This is Get Dose signing off, but the conversation continues in the comments. Share your thoughts. Could more have been done to stop this tragedy? And what responsibility do we all bear in protecting those who can't protect themselves?